Summary of Trifles by Susan Glaspell. At the beginning of the play, there is an abandoned farmhouse. There are a lot of unfinished tasks around the house, like dishes that need to be washed and bread that is ready to be baked but not yet. 5 people, including the county attorney, George Henderson, the local sheriff, Henry Peters, and the neighbor, Lewis Hale, go to the house to look into a murder scene. They find John Wright, who has been killed with a rope in his bed. 2 of the men's wives, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, are with them. For the country attorney, Mr. Hale talks about what it was like to find John Wright's body the day before. He asked his neighbors if they would like to put in a party line phone when he stopped by their house. When he saw Minnie Wright sitting in her rocking chair, she told him quietly that her husband had died. Mr. Hale went upstairs to look for the body and then left everything where it was so the lawyer and the police could look at it. She said she wasn't awake when her husband was suffocated in bed with her. Minnie Wright, Mrs. Wright, has been charged with the crime and is being held until her hearing. The men don't look closely around the kitchen for clues about what the woman is up to, but they do find Minnie's frozen and broken fruit jars. Minnie was afraid that her canning jars would blow up in the cold, and Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale know this. The sheriff jokes that a woman would worry about such things while being held for murder. The men say that Minnie doesn't clean up after herself because there is a mess in the kitchen and a dirty towel. While the guys check out the bedroom upstairs, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale get things from the kitchen that Minnie asked to be brought to her at the jail, like clothes and an apron. The women talk about how strange it is that a man was strangled to death after the men had said there was a gun in the house. The women are admiring Minnie's quilt and wondering if she was going to finish it by quilting or nodding when the men come back in and make fun of the women's silly worries at this very moment. The women notice that some of the quilt stitching is very bad, as if Minnie were worried or upset after being left alone by the men again. The women then find a birdhouse that doesn't have any birds in it. Mrs. Hale feels terrible that she didn't come visit Minnie more often. She knows that John Wright was a mean person and that Minnie must have found it hard to be alone at her house. She thinks about Minnie before she got married and how happy she was when she sang in the choir. The women then find a pretty red box with the dead bird that was lost from the cage and whose neck was broken inside. Mrs. Hale hides the box with the bird's body inside until the men come back. As soon as the guys leave again, Mrs. Peters thinks of the boy who killed her kitten when she was a child and how she would have hurt him back if she could. But the law has to punish crime, Mrs. Peters says. Who's going to punish that crime? Mrs. Hale asks herself as she beats herself up for what she sees as her sin of not visiting her friend Minnie. When the guys come back, the sheriff asks the county attorney if he wants to look at the things Mrs. Peters is bringing to the jail for Minnie. He says Mrs. Peters doesn't need to be watched and thinks the things she's taking won't hurt her. The women hide the bird's body in a box. The county attorney jokes that at least they found out what happened to Minnie's quilt project. Mrs. Hale tells him that she was going to put the finishing touches on the quilt by knotting it.
About the author. Susan Glaspell was born in 1876 and grew up in a small town in Iowa. In spite of what most people in her community thought, she felt that women had the right to education and continued her education. She went to Drake University and did very well in the debate events there, which were mostly for men. Glaspell worked as a reporter after college, writing about murder cases. Trifles is based on a case Glaspell covered. She quit her job when she saw the woman in the case get a life sentence for killing her cruel husband. Glaspell met and fell in love with George Cook through the theater group she was in Davenport. Cook was already married. When they moved to New York City, they joined the country's first avant-garde movement, which was made up of artists and activists. They also started the Provincetown Players theater group on Cape Cod, and Glaspell was in several plays even though she hadn't had any professional training. During this time, 1916, she also wrote Trifles. The play was first put on by the Provincetown Players. The work she did after that was also seen as groundbreaking. The Verge, 1921, one of the first works of expressionist art in America, and Inheritors, 1921, which is thought to be the country's first modern history play. Later, the two quit their theater company because it had become too successful for their original creative goals and moved to Delphi, Greece. After Cook died in 1924, Glaspell went back to Cape Cod. Toward the end of her life, she had problems with alcoholism and depression. On July 27, 1948, she died of pneumonia.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.